Can you all hear me in the back, by the way? Yeah. So thank you, Herman. Thank you, Francisca. Thank you, Mitch. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you. I've really enjoyed this retreat, and it's really been such an honor to be part of a Fulbright program. And this retreat is certainly part of all that. I must say that I was super impressed with the quality of the discussion and the questions. I mean, I think this is one of the brightest audiences I've ever spoken to. So my Fulbright Fellowship is co-sponsored by the Freud Museum. And this is a special significance to me because I'm a psychiatrist and also a neuroscientist, and the Freud Museum is like, the birthplace of modern psychiatry. And so to be able to come here and do the work that I'm doing is just really just very special and a real honor. What I'm doing is I'm teaching a 12-week course on this topic of neuroscience, of memory and emotion, and its influence on outcome in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. And I'm also doing a research project, actually more than one, which goes along in the same topic. And toward the end of this talk, I'll tell you about one of the projects that we're doing. I'm hoping to turn the lectures that I'm giving into a book. And the book is going to be geared for psychiatry residents in the United States who need to learn psychotherapy, but they're kind of gradually losing interest in psychodynamic psychotherapy and finding that they're preferring cognitive behavioral therapy, which is more skills-oriented. And I think that's a shame because it's kind of based on the idea that psychodynamics and psychoanalysis isn't well enough validated scientifically. And so my mission is to try to reposition the theoretical foundation of psychodynamic psychotherapy and psychoanalysis on this more empirical and neuroscience-based foundation. But just a little bit about my background. I finished my training in medicine and psychiatry 40 years ago. So, and I've been, practicing and teaching and supervising psychiatry and psychiatric trainees for 40 years, in academic positions the whole time. I was very fortunate once I actually had tenure that I got a Scientist Development Award from the National Institutes of Health that provided 5 years of funding to get training to become an independent investigator. And I got that training in neuroimaging and emotion research. And this background in cognitive and affective neuroscience has really, affected the way I view the clinical work. And what I'm presenting today is kind of an outgrowth of that dual, perspective of having a basic science orientation to the clinical work that we're doing. So the whole field of psychotherapy started with Freud, and his ideas, some of his ideas are still current today. So, one of the questions that we asked was, how relevant is Freud? And here's my 30-second summary. Certainly a leading intellectual of the 20th century, invented psychoanalysis, the first talk therapy, and pointed out the importance of unconscious factors in mental life. He's best known for his contributions to personality theory, the unconscious mind, mechanisms of defense, and dream interpretation. And he really changed how society views mental illness and kind of the perspective that early childhood experiences and development really influence who you come to be as an adult. But his stature in academic psychology and clinical psychology has fallen over time as his theories have been difficult or impossible to test scientifically. And that has affected the fate of clinical psychoanalysis and psychodynamic psychotherapy. Just so you know, psychoanalysis proper is at 4 to 5 times a week for an hour each time for multiple years. Psychodynamic psychotherapy is a more abbreviated approach based on the same principles, but it's a little bit more expedited, but they kind of go together. And they're kind of, certainly in the United States, in decline. Because, and this is taken from a paper 20 years ago from a leading psychoanalyst named Peter Fonagy in London. But what he said then is certainly true today, if not more so. Insurers prize brief, structured interventions that are cost effective. Symptom change as a primary outcome is limiting. For example, focusing on depression, focusing on anxiety. Many therapies like CBT really focus on improving those symptoms, but in psychoanalysis, psychodynamic psychotherapy, we're trying to get more to the root cause. We're not just interested in symptoms. Teaching psychoanalysis is challenging due to the plethora of ideas. There are at least 6 different schools of thought within psychoanalysis, and they have not been integrated, and some are contradictory. A genuine objective research tradition is lacking. Freud thought that the psychoanalytic consulting room was a wonderful scientific laboratory, but it's not completely objective, of course, because for one thing, we know that the analyst's emotional responses are an important part of the whole process, which interfere with pure objectivity. Single case studies aren't adequate for generalization. And a comprehensive model of the mind must be open to other perspectives. I think there's longstanding interest in psychoanalysis in developing the theory within its own boundaries, but what we're trying to do now is expand to integrate more with neuroscience in general. It turns out that was not inconsistent with some of the things that Freud said, because Freud was originally a neurologist, practiced for a number of years, and then he invented psychoanalysis in 1895. But he really had this dream of a brain-based understanding of mind. And here are some quotes. 1914, 20 years into it, we must recollect that our provisional ideas in psychology will presumably someday be based on organic substructure. We're taking this probability into account in replacing the special chemical substances by special psychical forces. As you know, he created id, ego, and superego, which are kind of hypothetical constructs. The deficiencies in our description would probably vanish if we were already in a position to replace the psychological terms by physiological or chemical ones. In 1920, and again in 1920, biology is truly a land of unlimited possibilities. We may expect it to give us the most surprising information, and we cannot guess what answers it will return in a few dozen years to the questions we have put to it. This is in 1920. So it turns out that it took a century to kind of validate one of the ideas about memory that I'll tell you about. But what we're really talking about is different ways of understanding the mechanisms of the mind, right? Can we understand it psychologically? What if we can understand it neurobiologically? So to illustrate this idea of mechanisms and what a difference they make, this is the beautiful Arizona Sonoran Desert where I'm from in Tucson. And you see our lovely saguaro cacti in the Sonoran Desert. And we see the sun setting in the west, right? It's a very common way of saying what's happening. But is the sun really setting in the west? To put it another way, why does the sun disappear over the horizon in the evening? Well, one possibility is that the sun actually sets in the west, and that would actually be the Aristotle's view of the universe, with the Earth in the center and the sun rotating around, okay? In fact, we would tend to agree with Copernicus at this point, with the Earth rotating around the sun. So it's not that the sun is setting in the west, it's that the Earth is rotating on its axis. Okay, that's not as nice to say, but but the key point is that to the human eye, these two mechanisms look identical. You cannot tell the difference. But the mechanisms underlying the phenomenology matter a lot. Because, with Isaac Newton, understanding of, physics from him, 350 years of development has led to this kind of, capacity with telescopes, the Hubble telescope, and now the James Webb Space Telescope. This is the same image, with much greater resolution, right? Seeing billions and billions of light years away. So whole new worlds open up when the mechanisms are understood, right? And so what we're really trying to do is understand the mechanisms. That was question number 4 in your discussion groups. How does this actually work? Okay. And Galileo, was the first person to use a telescope, and the magnification, was maybe 5 times, 10 times the naked eye. But that was really kind of revolutionary. The point I would want to make here is that when it comes to viewing the external world, we've had 350 years of development and James Webb Space Telescope. We have functional neuroimaging of the brain, but I would say that in terms of development, we've had that for 40 years or so, and this is kind of where we are in terms of understanding the internal world. But, Galileo was onto something, and I think we are as well with functional neuroimaging and cognitive neuroscience. So in 2015, my colleagues and I published this paper, Memory Reconsolidation, Emotional Arousal, and the Process of Change in Psychotherapy, New Insights from Brain Science. And it was published in this journal, Behavioral and Brain Sciences, which some of you may know is a very leading neuroscience journal. And part of the fact that it's a leading journal means that it's very hard to get it published. And as testimony to that, our first submission came back with reviews from 16 very knowledgeable reviewers with 14 single-space pages of comments. And it took us quite a while to respond to these comments. And it was a perfect example of how the peer review process can be painful, but can be extremely useful. What we were trying to do was trying to explain how therapy works, right, by virtue of understanding this neuroscience of memory and emotion. So memory reconsolidation refers to the idea that memories can change, and everybody seems to intuitively grasp this. But it was only in the year 2000 that was definitively proven that memories can be updated. Just in terms of terminology, you have an experience, like today's talk, and then that's in short-term memory. Then at night you sleep, and it gets consolidated into long-term memory. But what's been discovered is that whenever memories are recalled or reactivated, they go into a labile state and become modifiable and updatable with new information. Then there's also this special relationship between emotion and memory, because we can't remember everything, but we need to remember what's most important. And what this is all about is how to exploit these phenomena to maximize clinical benefit. Okay? So my co-authors, 2 memory researchers, and Les Greenberg, who invented emotion-focused psychotherapy and has helped to prove that certain ways of activating emotion during psychotherapy lead to better outcome. This is in 2015. We felt that we had really accomplished something by getting this paper published, but we had only scratched the surface. So we decided to have a conference and create a book, which was published in 2020. Came out in March 2020, just when COVID hit. Not great for sales. But what this book has 16 chapters. It's basically divided into first half of basic science of memory, emotion interactions, the role of sleep in memory, which is really fascinating. Next section on different kinds of psychotherapy and how those therapies are thought to work with reference to memory reconsolidation. And then some summary chapters, including one that defined the research agenda, both basic and clinical, which as academics, that was of special interest to us. So, in the 2015 paper, and then reiterated in the book, we proposed that there are 3 essential ingredients for enduring change in psychotherapy. Let me mention enduring change. if you can change your memories, then the problems, then you're not likely to be at risk for relapse, okay? But other kinds of techniques, such as exposure therapy, work by extinction, which actually suppresses the learning but doesn't change the learning. So that creates vulnerability to relapse. That's why we're talking about enduring change, which is something that psychoanalysis has always aspired to. So we said there are three basic steps: activate old memories and old feelings with or without awareness of connection to the past. So I think it's really important to activate those painful emotions that people are keeping at bay, that we think are contributing to the ongoing difficulty. Freud certainly was on to that, okay, in 1895. But we've taken it farther because we think that you have to concurrently engage new emotional experiences that change the old memories and update them through reconsolidation by transforming and expanding the emotional content of memories. And then third, reinforce the strength of these new memories and their semantic structures by practicing new ways of behaving and experiencing the world in a variety of contexts. Because these reminders will keep coming up, the memories will become labile, and you have to keep responding in a particular way to kind of reinforce the new way of doing things. So one of the reasons why being at the Freud Museum is very special is that we really think that Sigmund Freud was the very first person to describe memory reconsolidation as we now know it. And he described it in 1896. He called it memory retranscription. And it was only in the year 2000 that a definitive study was done with rodents published in Nature that proved that memories become labile and are modifiable. Okay, so why are we so interested in memory, right? Well, it's not just for recalling the past, it's a guide to the future. Memory is adaptive because it keeps a record of what did and didn't work in the past. The key benefit is that it serves as a guide to similar situations in the future. In fact, the brain's constantly making predictions about what's happening now and likely to happen in the near future based on these memories. Having some capacity to update memories in light of changing circumstances can optimize adaptive flexibility, but changes must be made prudently. Okay. So now I'm going to show you something to illustrate predictive processing. And I want you to look at this, and I want someone to tell me what this is. Okay. Hard to make sense out of it. Some people kind of see it as like a Rorschach ink blot, like there's an angel here, right? Or can you tell what this is? It's hard to tell, right? No volunteers. Okay. Now I'm going to show you something that will be informative about what this is. Okay. All right. So now we're going to look at these side by side. And I would say that this is an illustration of the power of predictive processing, the role of expectations and perception, right? If you look at this picture now, can you look at this without thinking about what you already know, right? You can kind of make sense out of it. So what I want you to do is a little thought experiment and think about being in a social situation where you're kind of disoriented and you don't know what's going on. It's kind of like this the first time you saw it. But then, once you get your bearings and have some way of thinking about it, you can view this in a different way, right? The seemingly chaotic stimulus set actually begins to make sense, right? Okay. Well, now we're going to try to make the argument that this is relevant to the recurrent maladaptive patterns that people have that bring them to psychotherapy. These patterns are an expression of implicit emotional memories. Okay. Clients often come to psychotherapy because they're unhappy with aspects of their social or occupational lives. They're typically unaware that this is part of a behavioral pattern triggered by interpersonal situations that are reminders of problematic situations from the past. So you automatically are making predictions and responding based on what has worked or not worked in the past. The problematic response to these situations consists of behavioral patterns that aim to ensure avoidance of the experience of intolerable emotion. Okay, so this is a very condensed version of this talk. I usually have an hour, so I hope I'll be able to make things clear enough here. So use the example of the case of Becky. This was a treatment for 6 sessions that you can view on an American Psychological Association video by a therapist named Hannah Levinson who specializes in time-limited dynamic psychotherapy. And she accomplished a lot in 6 sessions. Okay. So Becky's mother, she's a 25-year-old young lady who was Becky's mother was alcohol dependent, and Becky learned that she had to attend to her mother's needs. Her mother wasn't very available to attend to her needs. Moreover, father was demanding and expected top performance. So as a result, Becky became quite perfectionistic and learned not to impose her needs on others for fear of rejection if she did. That was the intolerable emotion that she was avoiding by being perfectionistic. Okay. Well, turned out that she had this boyfriend who she loved very much, but this boyfriend was often inconsiderate. He got drunk quite frequently, every session was stories about how he got drunk and was inconsiderate of her. But she kept her feelings to herself and often cried herself to sleep. Okay. So the therapy involves paying attention to her emotional pain, reactivating these memories and the painful emotions associated with them. And what did she need, right? She needed to be loved and accepted. There were interactions with the therapist in step 2 that were corrective, that helped her to feel that she was worthy of being treated well. And then in step 3, she started taking action in her relationships to increase the likelihood that her needs would be met. And in fact, she did that with her boyfriend, who in 6-year follow-up became her husband. That was okay. So there's a lot there, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'm just going to keep going. Okay, now we're moving to a little bit of science. Okay, we had the question about, does emotion influence memory? Well, yes, it does. And so there's this phenomenon of flashbulb memory. How many people remember 9/11? How many people? Okay. How many people weren't born at the time of 9/11? Okay. Okay. A flashbulb memory is a vivid, not long-lasting memory about a shocking event that happened in the past. When I was 10 years old, Kennedy was assassinated, so I'll never forget that. Okay. The subjects in the New York area were interviewed a few days after 9/11, 11 months after, 3 years, and 10 years after 9/11. And there was a surprising decrement in personal detail recall at 11 months. But their confidence in their memory was very high, so they didn't think it had changed, which is very interesting. And then the memory stabilized and was then consistent at 11 months, 3 years, and 10 years. And people talked about how they kind of begin to remember their memory or the telling of the memory, and they remember that. And I think that accounts for the consistency here. So even strong memories are malleable, okay? How can we convert this into some kind of laboratory study? Because the idea is that when memories are made labile, when you reactivate memories, they become modifiable, right? All right, so this is work done at the University of Arizona. And it involved undergraduates and involved learning lists of objects, nonsense syllable stories. Okay, so the first session, you learn new information. Then in the second session, the subjects are divided into 2 groups. Half the subjects are given a reminder of the first session, so they're brought to the same room, they have the same experimenter, and they're even asked a question about their experience from the first session. Whereas the other group, there's no reminder at all, right? Different experimenter, different room, no question, okay? And so obviously with these reminders in the first group, the memories from the first session are put into a labile state. Then in the second session, they learn a new set of information, okay? And then 2 days later, they're tested for their memory for the information in the first session. Because the idea is that if you make the first list malleable and updatable, and then at the same time you're learning a second list, then there might be some crossover between the two. Whereas if there's no reminder, it's not going to be vulnerable to that kind of intrusion. And that's what they found. So with the reminder, I mean, the percentage correct was very comparable, but there were many more intrusions in the reminders group than in the non-reminder group. And there's a meta-analysis showing that this has really been replicated numerous times. Okay. What about emotion? Well, the neuroscience on this is very strong. Synaptic plasticity, which is the molecular basis for encoding memories, is enhanced by the neurotransmitters and hormones, like norepinephrine and cortisol, that are activated by emotional arousal. Identifying and tagging what's important to remember is a foundational principle of memory function, right? Because the brain cannot possibly retain all the information that comes in during the day, nor would it want to, okay? So this is something that happens with all organisms, including humans, every single day. We take in information all day long and we go to sleep, and then there's this process of kind of cleaning house and figuring out what information to retain and integrate with what we already know and what to discard. Okay, so this is just an extension of that, and we're trying to exploit these principles for therapeutic benefit. How can we study this? Well, there was this classic study by Larry Cahill involving propranolol, which blocks the encoding of emotional content of episodic memories or event memories. So propranolol is a beta blocker. It's used for high blood pressure. It's used for performance anxiety. And it not only acts peripherally on sympathetic beta receptors to block them, it also crosses the blood-brain barrier and actually connects with the amygdala and inhibits its emotion encoding function. So participants took propranolol or placebo prior to hearing a story that had neutral details or both neutral and emotional details. And then 2 days later, subjects returned for a surprise memory test. The placebo group had more accurate memory for the emotional details, which makes sense. And the propranolol group's recall of emotional details was blunted, and their accuracy for the emotional details was comparable to recall for the neutral details. Okay. So, just some of the experimental evidence that supports this idea about the importance of emotion and its interaction with memory. All right. So, our goal is to kind of somehow be able to do neuroimaging of this memory reconsolidation, right? And so we thought long and hard about how we would go about doing this, and we've come up with an approach because the fundamental idea is that people have an internal working model of their social world, right? Adaptations are made in childhood that work in childhood but then cause problems later in life. So how could we create an internal working model of the social world experimentally? And we drew on the work of Daniela Schiller and her colleagues at Mount Sinai in New York, who published this very interesting paper in 2015 in the leading journal Neuron, a map for social navigation in the human brain, drawing on the longstanding observation that power and affiliation are two very important dimensions, foundational dimensions in social interaction. And so they created a video game where a person would arrive in town and would need to interact with people to find a job and find a place to live. Okay? And questions are posed and the answers are set up so that you can kind of place people on these two dimensions of affiliation and power. So, for example, the boss says, "Hayworth, I need you to stay later. We need to have it ready in 2 days." Okay? And so you have a choice. You could say, "Oh, whatever you need, boss." Or you could say, "I'm putting my best efforts in this project. Can I get paid extra time?" Okay? So you can see, dozens of questions like this. It turns out that you can reliably place people on this two-dimensional grid of affiliation and power. Okay. And what was amazing was they had the people play the game in the scanner, and it turns out that the hippocampus is tracking these two dimensions. Okay. So the hippocampus in general is involved in encoding spatial relationships. And this is kind of extending it conceptually to the social world, in the outside world. Okay. So that was the basis for thinking, okay, we can have an experimental paradigm for mapping the social world of the person. For the past 3 years, we have done online studies to add an additional element, emotional learning, right? So you have an interaction with, say, the boss, and he's kind of mean to you. And then you sleep on that, consolidate that. And then you come back the next day and you have new interactions where he's nice and he's apologetic and he actually helps a disabled person across the street. And so, it increases your trust. And we've been able to show behaviorally that change happens. And now what we want to do is have people do a multi-day study in the scanner to see what's happening in the brain, right? To study emotional updating of social schematic memory. And this is being done in Lausanne, Switzerland. So we want to ask the question, can schematic memory be updated by new emotional information? We think we have a paradigm that does that. Does this updating increase trust in the other person? We can play a trust game and demonstrate behaviorally that they increase trust in the boss. But now the neuroscience. Does updating involve interactions between the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex? Right? And so we're expecting that there will be these interactions with the amygdala being an emotion encoding center and the hippocampus, we said, is doing this mapping. And so we're hoping to view these interactions. And I had mentioned before that in the case of trauma, you have hyperactivity of the amygdala and inhibition of the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex that interferes with encoding of traumatic memories. So, do I have time? Yeah, okay. So this is what a psychotherapy practice were based on memory reconsolidation principles. Okay. Whenever you activate or reactivate a memory, the reconsolidation window stays open for 4 to 6 hours. So when we do psychotherapy, we don't think about what happens after the session, right? But maybe we should start thinking about it, right? So, for example, arousal after a session can tag what came before. So if you're very angry and then you go to work out, that's really going to really reinforce that angry feel, for example. Napping and sleeping could actually help to consolidate or reconsolidate an experience that you had to lock in changes that might have happened in the therapy session without interference from other things that are happening. So these are just implications and examples of things to research, but it raises a question about the value of retreat-style interventions where you might have short sessions, but you have a corrective experience, and then you take a nap, and then you have another session later. Maybe multiple sessions in a day. You pay careful attention to your post-session activities. You would take naps as appropriate. And these medications, SSRIs, SNRIs, tricyclic benzodiazepines, that are used for the treatment of anxiety and depression, they happen to inhibit REM sleep when emotional memories get consolidated and reconsolidated. These are valuable medications, but long-term use could potentially interfere with the psychotherapy mechanisms we're talking about. So to conclude, Freud's ideas about memory, emotion-memory interactions, psychological trauma, and the role of childhood development in adult personality are still relevant today. Freud's psychological models of the mind were temporary solutions that were never objectively demonstrable. We now understand enough about how therapy works and the brain basis of key ingredients of change that it may be possible to reposition psychoanalysis on a stronger empirical footing. This may involve adjustments to how therapy is done, emphasizing emotion as a key mechanism of change in interaction with memory. Doing so can potentially revitalize the field and help to make Freud's dream of a brain-based understanding of mind a reality. Thank you very much.